Before I invite our first speaker for the day, I have to do what we do always, which is to say my thank yous. First of all, to all of you. For being here every year, we are encouraged by the faith that you place in us and the desire that you demonstrate by coming here and spending 2.5 days from your very, very busy schedules. So thank you. Secondly, our sponsors and partners. Without their support, irrespective of our intent, we wouldn't be able to be here with all of you and give you a good time. And finally, my team, which works endlessly each year for many months to make this possible. So can I have a big round of applause for everyone who's made today possible? Please be engaged, please participate and share your thoughts. Like every year, the greater wisdom is always in the room as opposed to the stage. So I look forward to the next 2.5 days. I am going to now invite our first speaker for the day. We are very, very privileged, and it's a pleasure to have with us Dr. Shashi Tharoor to set the framework and the thinking for our conclave. When we were deciding the theme, we were wondering who could combine two things, knowledge and imagination. Because this is not about the past. This is about being able to look at the past, but actually imagine and predict or shape and help us think about the future. And to do justice to a theme like this and its interpretation, we were quite unanimous in our choice of Dr. Shashi Tharoor. We saw his Oxford debate soon after, and there was no debate left any longer. He needs no introduction. If anything, you can decide how you want to think about him. Member of Parliament, diplomat, minister, author, spokesperson, thinker. He's all of these and more. So without any more ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tharoor.
Good afternoon. Hope you all had a good lunch and I'm not nodding off. I'll try and keep you awake for a little while. It's really a pleasure. I've just been talking to Pramatraj Sinha and, of course, Ajit Ranade and now Anuradha. Very pleased to see this illustrious gathering of CFOs of several well-known companies gathered here to discuss an edgy new world. I guess if I had taken up the IIM admissions that I got right out of college, I might have been amongst you rather than standing on this podium instead. But I guess life had a global path chalked out for me. When I left for the US, globalization wasn't even a buzzword, but I ended up leading a fairly global life. A Malayali born in London, raised in Mumbai, in Calcutta, college in Delhi, graduate school in the US, worked in Europe, in Southeast Asia, and again in New York before returning to India. So in many ways I embody the kind of globalization that in many ways we cannot escape from today. I often give the example of the tragic death of Princess Diana, and people say, so what's that got to do with globalization? And the explanation very simply is, think of it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She is driven in a German car with a Dutch engine by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish liquid. They are chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorcycles into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the whole story is now being told to you by an Indian MP from Thiruvananthapuram. That's globalization, right? So, the fact is that there is no escaping globalization, and that's my first point about today's world. Even in a country like India, don't forget that for the longest time, self-reliance and self-sufficiency were a mantra in our country's politics and economics for more than 4 decades after independence. Indeed, we were quite unwilling to open ourselves to the world economy. We closed the few openings that there were. And whereas in a country like America, most people axiomatically associate capitalism with freedom, here in India we used to associate capitalism with slavery. Why? Because the British East India Company came here to trade and stayed on to rule. So our nationalists were deeply suspicious of foreign capital, of anyone coming from outside. Every foreigner with a briefcase was assumed to be the thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. The fact is that aside from a handful of post-colonial countries like Singapore, for example, most others went this way. They were suspicious. They were convinced that the political independence they had fought so hard for and so long for could only be guaranteed through economic independence. And so the self-reliance slogan, which was India's slogan, was the rallying cry of the developing world in those days. The protectionist barriers went up, and India spent, 45 years at least with bureaucrats rather than businessmen on the commanding heights of the economy, spending these first 4.5 decades subsidizing unproductivity, regulating stagnation, and trying to distribute actually poverty, which only goes to prove that one of the lessons you learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. Now, it's important to appreciate the extent of the paradigm shift that was needed for a country like India to give up the cherished assumptions of the independence movement, of the nationalist struggle, and chart a new course. It took a world-class financial crisis in 1991 to prompt India to make that change, and now it seems truly irreversible. In the 24 years since then, we've had governments of every conceivable political stripe in India, and none of them has reversed the achievements of liberalization or moved to reduce the global connectedness of the Indian economy. After all, what does it mean to be a young person in Delhi today, for example? Many of you are of an age that your kids are teenagers. It can mean for them waking up to an alarm clock made in China, downing a cup of tea from leaves first planted by the British, donning jeans designed in America, taking a Japanese scooter or a Korean car to go to an Indian college, where your textbooks might be printed with a German-invented technology on paper first popped in Sweden. You might call your friends on a Finnish or now increasingly a Taiwanese mobile phone to invite them to an Italian pizza, or even what you think of as an Indian meal, featuring naan that came to us from Persia, tandoori chicken taught to us by rulers from Uzbekistan, and aloo and hari mirch, which of course first came to India only 400 years ago, indirectly from Latin America. So the most desi thing of all, of course, is suspicion of anything foreign. But this is what India is today. In such a world, issues that seem very far away are very much in your backyard. That is what happens in East Asia or in Southern Africa, from protectionist policies to desertification to deforestation, to fight against AIDS. All of this can affect your lives here in North India. And your choices anywhere, what you buy, what you eat, how you vote, all of this can resound far away. As someone once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. We are all interconnected, and we can no longer afford the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the planet in anything we do. Second, there is a paradox at the heart of this globalized new world. When we think about the forces of globalization irresistibly transforming the world, as I've described, we also think of the information technology revolution. I think Anuradha mentioned it already. That brings to our breakfast tables and our living rooms, and increasingly to our computers and our mobile phones, snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. These are what one can call the forces of convergence, which have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But the opposite also exists. We have to think about the changes that terrorism and conflict have wrought on the world. The aftermath of 9/11, and for us 26/11, the war on terror, the rise in violent manifestations of intolerance, and now, of course, the ongoing wars in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and elsewhere. These are the forces of disruption that threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, between people of different religions and cultures and faiths. In other words, the very forces that through globalization are pulling us together seem at the very same time, through international terrorism and all these clashes, to be driving us apart. The terrible notion of a clash of civilizations has entered our discourse, as the previously benign forces of religion, of culture and society have become causes of conflict in many places rather than of succor. I often talk about how, going back to 9/11, those hijackers used all the instruments of modern technology, right? I mean, modern communications, jet planes, these skyscrapers that were emblematic of modern capitalism, in order to wreak their destruction, while their doomed victims made frantic mobile phone calls to their loved ones just before the planes crashed. I mean, what a symbol this was of the way in which the things that we think of as benign forces became instruments of destruction. And you can see the same on 26/11. They're using GPS, they're using satellite technology, they're using mobile phones to talk to their handlers in Pakistan. They're monitoring real-time TV broadcasts of the attack to get guidance on what to do next. All these modern tools that we see of as actually representing the convergence side of this equation I've described were used for disruption. And that, to my mind, is the alarming thing about the global village, that as we saw in 9/11, a fire that starts in a dusty cave in one remote corner of the global village can be strong enough to melt the steel girders underpinning the tallest skyscrapers at the opposite end of the global village. Third, about this edgy new world, globalization does not flow only in one direction. When Jamshedji Tata was denied admission to Pike's Hotel in Bombay at the peak of the British Empire, what was his reaction? He built a grander, more opulent hotel that was open to Indians, unlike Pike's, and that was the Taj Mahal. The Taj is today considered one of the world's finest hotels, whereas Pike's has long since closed. Now that's the metaphor, but that's 100 years old. Yet, if you look, when Mr. Tata opened the first steel mill in the face of implacable British hostility in 1905, a senior British imperial official sneeringly said that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. What a pity he didn't live long enough to see the same Tata and his descendants acquiring the remnants of British steel through the acquisition of Chorus a century later. Would have given him a bad case of indigestion. Or indeed, what he would have felt when Indians on the internet sent out these photographs when Prime Minister David Cameron, after winning the election, drove to Buckingham Palace in what they pointed out was an Indian-owned car, the Jaguar, being escorted by another Indian-owned Land Rover, the British Prime Minister going to Buckingham Palace. But I say this only to stress that it's time to set aside the old stereotypes of who can and cannot excel at what in our globalizing world. The smartest executive jets today are made by Embraer of Brazil. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, and it supplanted one that was in Taipei, which in turn replaced one that was in Malaysia. The Challenger to the Panama Canal, cutting through Nicaragua, is being built by China. The world's biggest plane is being made in Russia and Ukraine. The biggest shopping mall in the world is actually in Beijing. And the country with the highest per capita income in the world is not the United States, but Singapore. Now, 30 years ago, all of these categories would have been led by the United States. The US sure remains the world's sole superpower, but others are catching up fast in the various areas where it had once been dominant. It's not so much the decline of the West as the rise of the rest. A couple of decades ago, for example, no one would have mentioned India and high technology in the same breath. Now, and partially because of the migration to America of a number of Indian engineers from the 1960s onwards, the products of our IITs, we've now created a whole new perception of India around the world and starting in America. The engineers, of course, acquired in India a solid grounding in their field. They excel in the freedom afforded to them, the business freedom afforded to them in the US. And what did we see as a result? An Indian invented the Pentium chip, another Indian created Hotmail, a third started Sun Microsystems, and Indians have been involved in some 40% of all the startups in Silicon Valley. Over time, the Indianness of engineers and software developers began to be taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. Today, Americans speak of the IITs with the same reverence that they used to speak about MIT or Caltech. So the image of India has therefore changed in my own sort of experience of America from that of a backward developing country to a sophisticated land that produces engineers and computer experts. You know, there's a marvelous cartoon that I saw in America showing, you know, a parent 20 years ago, 25 years ago, saying to the child, "You better eat your food because there are children starving in India." And then the next panel, this similar kind of parent 25 years later saying, "You better do your homework because there are children studying in India." That's now become the change in the attitudes. In fact, sometimes this has unintended consequences because we've seen this change from the land of half-naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, to this land of computer geeks and software wizards. But it can have unintended consequences because a friend of mine who, like me, majored in history at college, found himself accosted at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam by an anxiously perspiring European who was saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop?" I mean, the idea was that if anyone knows what to do, it would be an Indian. So that is the other upending of stereotypes. Fourth, this new edgy new world, this new millennium is a time for diversity. In 1996, Professor Samuel Huntington looked at the globalizing world emerging from the Cold War and predicted a clash of civilizations. He was wrong. Civilizations are not monoliths. Each of the civilizations he analyzed, in fact, actually has a great deal of diversity within it. And religion and culture are merely amongst the many variables governing the actions and policies of states. Very often, states who have the same religion or religion in common may have other differences amongst them. You can just look at the contrasting positions taken by different Islamic states over the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, to illustrate the point. And again, the divisions right now between, say, Iran and the Arab countries are another illustration that what Huntington saw as the Islamic civilization is far too simplistic an idea. Now, the business leaders of tomorrow will have to know both how to live with change in a varied world and how to live with contradictions. To take a non-European example, I've been telling foreign audiences for years that anything I tell them about India, the opposite is also true. We like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we're also a young republic. Our IT experts stride confidently into the 21st century, but the majority of our population still lives in each of the other 20 centuries. Quite often, the opposites coexist quite cheerfully. I don't know how many of you saw on the internet during not the last Kumbh Mela, but the one before that, of a classic picture that went around of a naked sadhu. Right, I mean, right out of central casting, this guy had the matted grey hair, wispy beard, Rudraksha mala around his neck, completely sort of naked, staring off into the distance in a sense. You might imagine that he's your classic cliched picture of timeless otherworldliness. But in this picture that went around the internet, this same naked sadhu is actually chatting away on a mobile phone. Now that is the contradiction that one has to grasp. I actually suggested this to the publishers of one of my books as a perfect cover image, but they thought it was too much of a cliche already. And the fact is that nonetheless, to be in business, you have to acknowledge that you're functioning in a world where a naked Hindu holy man comfortably uses a cell phone. And you have to learn to embrace the possibilities and the complications that represents. Now, one of the paradoxes of the 20th century was that it was trying to make the world safe for democracy. In the 21st century, the great challenge is to make the world safe for diversity. The world as a whole needs to reflect the idea that has been anyway, inherently familiar to Indians. The idea that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is, the kind of food you eat, the God you choose to worship or not, the sounds you make, so long as you want to play by the same rules as everybody else and dream the same dreams. It's not essential in a democratic world to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. That's always, to my mind, been the great Indian secret. The author Benjamin Barber has written of the twin prospects facing humanity today as jihad versus Macworld. And I'm quoting him, jihad in the name of 100 narrowly conceived fates against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, unquote, versus a Macworld of globalization run rampant, a world of fast music, fast computers and fast food, with MTV, Macintosh and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park. Now that's quote unquote from Benjamin Barber. But the interesting thing is that both jihad and Macworld actually end up by obliterating our most precious possession, which is our sense of what makes us special, our distinctive individual identity. We need to strive for a world in which we can preserve our individual identities and yet work in cooperation with each other. The only solution, therefore, is to fight for diversity. Fifth, the new world is seeing the rise of old problems. We think of religious wars and crusades, for example, as relics of medieval history. Yet they come back to haunt us. They've come back to haunt us in the second decade of the 21st century, particularly with the rise of ISIS or Daesh, as the Arabs call it. Now, why are so many political grievances, real or imagined, articulated in religious terms? The answer surely lies in the primordial nature of religious identity. As a writer, I'm attracted to what one might call a plural construct of identity, of which religion is only one part, and perhaps to many not even the most important part. We each have many identities, right? So I can say that I'm a Malayali, I can say I'm an Indian, I can say I'm a cricket fan, I can say I'm a Congress party supporter, etc., etc. I'm a Stephanian. I can choose multiple labels depending on the context in which I'm focusing the essence of my identity at that moment. And so therefore being a Hindu for me is one out of these multiple possible identities. But where avenues of identity mobilization are restricted as in autocratic states, or difficult, as in those societies where political patterns are entrenched and admit few interlopers, ordinary people tend to fall back upon the one identity that seems basic to them. So a secular intellectual like Amartya Sen, or for that matter myself, may give equal weight to the tag of being a cricket fanatic or a Stephanian to the fact of being born in a Hindu family. But we have to learn to admit that not everybody sees the world that way. It would be unwise of us to ignore the clarion call of religious fanaticism to so many desperate young men and even a few women around the world. So when you have madrasas producing kids to follow the creed of the Quran and the Kalashnikov, the Quran crudely interpreted and the Kalashnikov crudely made, that is a reality of today's world that we can't escape. Now, of course, there's something precious and valuable about religion, something that allows a human being to see himself at one with others stretching their hands out towards God around the world. But can we separate religion from identity and then from politics? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place, but where it will no longer be associated with the need to belong and the need to rule or dominate? Because that's the only way we can avoid the twin perils of both jihad and Macworld. If we can somehow be able to assert the fact that each one of us is entitled to our own identity, indeed to our multiple identities, but that we don't have any right to attack others for asserting the same. Sixth, the old binaries of the Cold War era are no longer relevant. There are no longer two superpowers to be non-aligned between. Instead, I have often argued that the metaphor for today's globalized world is really that of the World Wide Web. In this increasingly networked world, we have a world in which everyone is connected through the web, not necessarily directly, sometimes overlapping networks, sometimes separate networks, sometimes collective networks, but we are all connected in this global web. And we have to work through multiple networks, and those networks will sometimes overlap with each other, with common membership, sometimes they'll be distinct, but they all serve our interests in different ways and for different purposes. Let me illustrate what I mean. For example, every year, our foreign minister meets her counterparts from Russia and China in something called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans in something called BRICS. Then she takes out the Russians, but keeps the Chinese in something called BASIC for environmental negotiations. But she drops both the Russians and the Chinese when she meets with the other two in something called IPSA for South-South cooperation. And of course, India is the only country that's a member of all of these groupings, and not merely because our name very conveniently begins with that very useful element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because each of these instruments helps serve our purposes, and we in turn have a contribution to make to each of them. This kind of World Wide Web style networking reflects other paradoxes of our world. So we try and play an influential role of the United Nations. We want a permanent seat in the Security Council, but we also focus on SAARC, the South Asian Association that only has our 7 neighbors. We belong to the non-aligned movement, which is a reflection of our colonial heritage. And we attack the Western countries that used to be the imperial powers, right? But at the same time, we belong to the community of democracies, where we work alongside the very Western countries we've attacked in the non-aligned movement. We're a leading light of the global trade union that's known as the G77 of developing countries. But we're also a leading light of the global management through our membership in the G20 that supervises the macroeconomic structure of the world. So we have this great ability to be in all these different institutional networks, pursuing different objectives with different allies and partners, and in each finding a valid purpose that suits us. This is why when I was minister, I suggested that we have moved beyond non-alignment to what I call multi-alignment. Though I must admit the phrase hasn't caught on. But that's really what we're doing. We are really multi-aligned. Look, let's face it, in the 21st century, you are likely to spend a lot of your lives, and certainly your children, most of their adult lives, will be spent interacting with people who don't look, sound, dress, or eat like you. You might work for an internationally oriented company with clients, colleagues, or investors from around the globe. You're likely to take your holidays in more and more far-flung destinations, unlike your parents who couldn't afford to go abroad, and if they did, were given $8 by the Reserve Bank of India to do so. So the world in which you're growing, the world in which we are all functioning, is full of such opportunities. But at the same time, it's also full of vulnerabilities and threats. Terrorism, of course, but also transnational crime syndicates, counterfeiters of currency, drug smugglers, child traffickers, internet spammers, credit card crooks, and even imported illnesses like swine flu, or AIDS for that matter, which cross all borders. So what you need increasingly is a world in which your government devises policies to deal with such policies, with such challenges that affect your and your children's lives. Should such policies in an ever more interdependent world even be called foreign? One of the reasons, thank you so much, the reasons that foreign policy matters today is that foreign policy is no longer merely foreign. It affects you right here where you live. All of us want our governments to seize these opportunities that the 21st century provides while managing the risks and protecting you from the threats that the world has also opened you up to. Right now we're seeing, just looming up here, an example of how countries in their domestic policies are being asked to make decisions that will signify an international role. And that's the Paris Convention on the Environment coming up in December this year. Individual countries are expected to determine their own agenda for reduction of carbon emissions by formulating their own intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. Now, the process of INDCs actually pairs national policy setting with international agendas. The countries will determine their contributions in the context of their national priorities, circumstances, and capabilities, but within a global framework. So it's an example of how the distinction between domestic and international is less and less meaningful in today's world. One is tied far more closely to the other than might appear. Right now, for example, the effects of the recent China market convulsions have confirmed again how dependent all other countries are. The value of the rupee has dropped. A ripple effect of the meltdown can be seen in the economic policies of many countries. Now, the ultimate purpose of any country's foreign policy in this edgy new world is to promote the security and well-being of its own citizens. So we need to work for a world in which we have the conditions of peace and security that will permit us, in your case, permit your businesses to grow and flourish. safe from foreign depredations, but open to external opportunities. Seventh, don't be alarmed. I'm counting these points for a reason. Back in the First World War, when President Woodrow Wilson announced his famous 14 points to end the war, the French President Clemenceau rather sourly said, 14 points? Even God had only 10. So don't worry, I'm going to stop before I get to 10, all right? No overweening pretensions there. So seventh, this involves working for change. The dominance of a handful of small industrialized Western countries in the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods organizations, as they're called, the World Bank and the IMF and so on, this looks increasingly anomalous in a world in which economic dynamism has irresistibly shifted to the east. So the emergence of powers and forces like ours, like China and so on, have changed this. Very clearly, the system that was set up in 1945 on the financial side is already cracking under the strain, and we in India would argue on the political side, the UN Security Council structure is also no longer adequate, largely because they were designed for a different world than the world in which we live in today. And why are we clamoring for that change? Because as the old saw goes, you're either on the table or you're on the menu. So we want to now be at the table. We don't want them to carve us up and eat us up. So what are we seeing with the BRICS countries, for example? The population of the BRICS countries is almost half the world, but the collective economic output of the BRICS countries is now almost the same as that of the US. And by 2040, it is likely that the economic output of the current BRICS countries will actually exceed the entire collective economic output of the original G7 countries, including the US, put together. So that's the kind of change you're talking about. We have to move towards a redistribution of power in the international financial institutions to reflect this. And you've seen, for example, that there is some resistance. It's absurd, it seems to me, that Belgium has the same weighted vote in the IMF as China does. But that's the reality of 1945, that they're still resistant to changing. And the question that comes up now is, if you don't change, in other words, what these countries are saying is, you either give us a level playing field, or we'll create our own playing field. And that's what's happened with China going off with the support of India and others to set up the BRICS Bank, the new development bank. That's, to some degree, a worrying sign. They're all making non-threatening noises saying, no, this is to complement the system, not to undermine it. Because they still want to say, you just give us a place in the existing system, we'll play ball. But unfortunately, the Western world, the statesmen of that era, of today's era, don't seem to have the farsightedness and statesmanship of their forefathers and foremothers of the 1940s. And so I really worry whether we can get these changes that I think are necessary. Similarly, we've also got the challenge that the Security Council reflects the geopolitical realities of 1945 rather than those of 2011. And that too absolutely needs to change. My eighth point was going to be about the mass media, but I've noticed with some alarm that I'm not leaving us enough time for questions. Very simply, to summarize it in 2 sentences, the mass media is now ubiquitous. It has a tremendous effect. We can talk about it some more. But is it having a democratizing effect? Arguably not. The internet was seen as the savior, the one that was going to bring everybody's voice equal prominence. I think it's contestable. In fact, I've argued that unlike the French Revolution, what you've got with the internet revolution is a lot of liberty, some fraternity, but no equality. And that's something too that we can talk about if you like, because it seems to me that you as managers will have to deal with a world in which communications and media are all important and yet are also skewed. But ninth and finally, you as managers have a role to play in ensuring that ours is a better world for our having been in it. And I think that as potential business leaders or as business leaders already, you have a responsibility to those who are not as fortunate as you are in navigating this edgy new world. And it seems to me that you're all in positions of privilege as CFOs. I believe I've been in a position of privilege, but I've had the opportunity to give back. And I urge you to think hard about what that sense of responsibility can entail. As a young man, I found myself working for the world's refugees, people who'd lost everything, including their homes. And that was a tremendous, tremendous experience, because I could put my head to the pillow at night, knowing that things I had done during the day had made a difference to real human beings' lives, people I could see and meet and see the transformations in their lives. Each of us has the capacity to do that, whether on an individual scale, on a company-wide scale, CSR, and even on a national scale through our influence on national policies and approaches. I urge you to do that. But I'm going to try and wrap up now so we can have some discussion in the Q&A period. There's this wonderful old thing about being like Egyptian mummies, because we're all strapped for time. And I have a plane to catch after this, so I do want to make sure we do this properly. Let me pull my strands together. My basic point is that in contemplating an edgy world, we have to think beyond the old tropes of superpower conflict and global domination to cooperative relationships in a networked world. Sovereign nation states will continue to try and guard their sovereignty. They'll try and guard the privileges they have. But the world will inevitably push them together in ways that transforms old definitions and their meanings, while at the same time threatening to undermine them and blow them apart. Most of us belong to countries, I think all of us belong to countries, I think we're all Indians here, so all of us belong to a country that proudly celebrates every year an Independence Day. But the time may have come now in today's world where we should realize that the rest of the time, at least, we need to recognize and celebrate the fact that every other day on this globalized calendar is really an Interdependence Day. Let me pause there for your questions. I look forward to interacting with the best financial minds of the country, and I certainly hope that you have a wonderful conference in the weekend ahead. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.